It's the year ending Monday the 31st of December 2018, and this is the Year Unwrapped, brought to you by Barclays Corporate Banking. In the past 12 months, we've seen Kim Jong-un announcing North Korea will denuclearize, Facebook's Cambridge Analytica scandal compromising 50 million people's data, and a 12-boy football team and their teacher rescued from a cave in Thailand. But we're here to bring you some of the trends that passed under the radar this year. Big changes that haven't made headlines but are slowly affecting the way we live our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the year. And joining me from the week's digital team are Arion, McNicoll, Rebecca Gillie and Kari Wilkin. And starting the show this week, it's Arion for the last time in 2018. What do you think this year will be remembered for?
This was the year we found out who run the world.
We've been hearing it over and over again.
A record number of women.
A surge of first-time female candidates.
It's all part of a national wave of women.
Women are running for office in record numbers, and 2018 is being called the Year of the Woman.
I think a lot of the excitement and energy that we're seeing in 2018 is a result of Donald Trump's victory.
Jennifer Lawless there, ending that video for The Washington Post called The Year of the Woman Goes Global. You can see it all on their YouTube channel. So, Arion, we've got two female contributors standing by, but of course I'm going to, as a man, ask you as a man to explain to me why you chose this to be your big story of 2018.
So 2018 marks 100 years since women won the vote in Britain, so it does seem fitting that it was also a record year for women's representation in politics worldwide. Women now make up 24% of all elected representatives across the world, which means we still have a long way to go. But if you consider that back in 2000, women made up just 13.8% of total elected representatives, it's a big shift. So as we heard in that clip, in the US, they're calling it the Year of the Woman. That's particularly because there were a record number of women elected in the midterm elections. But we've seen similar kinds of results all around the world. In Lebanon, a record 113 women registered as candidates, which is an 8-fold increase over the 12 women who ran back in 2009. In Mexico, 3,000 women ran in the June elections. In Sri Lanka.
So is Jennifer Lawless wrong then when she says that the catalyst is Donald Trump? Because it seems to be an international trend and therefore not just about this kind of, misogynist known sexual harasser in office.
I think it's an interesting theory. It seems a little bit of a US-centric theory to suggest that every country has reacted to Donald Trump's attitude to women in this positive way. I'd say that it probably is the case over in the US, but I'm not necessarily sure that it's contributing to the worldwide trend.
Okay, Woman's Hour. Rebecca, would you choose this as a trend of the year as well? Have you noticed a growing female representation in politics?
As Arion was just listing, I don't know how many more examples there were, probably countless ones. We have seen this reflected around the world. For instance, to add one of my own, the Spanish cabinet was majority female for the first time this year.
Don't forget House of Cards as well, of course. Does that not count?
Kind of. It's
fictional cabinet.
It's true, mired in controversy. But I think that one place we haven't really seen it so much is in this country. We kind of have had the difficulty of maybe we'll see it when we have our next election, which could be, sooner rather than later. We'll be able to see if that trend really has had as much of an impact here. But it makes me wonder, the thing that kind of this makes me think about is, has the profession of politician been so denigrated in this country that women are no longer seeing running for office as a positive expression of their female empowerment? In the US, it seems like there's been a big movement to push women into running for office and to inspire them and to see that as a positive way to, to act in the world. Whereas in this country, I just feel like we don't really have that same positivity around politics.
I think in the US, they've had more to push back against. Obviously, there's Donald Trump. There's also the confirmation of Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And interestingly, the last time there was a so-called Year of the Woman in America was 1992, which just followed the confirmation of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who was then accused of sexual misconduct. So I think it's definitely sort of very clearly a pushback in America. We have some pretty offensive politicians, don't get me wrong, but I don't think we have that. We have so much to push back against. But I do think worldwide we're seeing a snowball effect, just in the sense that as women contest and win elections worldwide, they're challenging the traditional norms of what a woman looks like. So, you know, in England, yes, we've still got a long way to go, in Britain. But, you know, in the 2017 elections, women accounted for 32% of seats, which is still above, you know, the world average. Still a long way to go, obviously. But I think, you know, certainly in many developing countries, you know, to add another example to Aryans in Sri Lanka, they've just recently changed legislation, and there was a 2,340% increase in the number of women in parliament as a result. So, you know, I think it all rolls into each other.
And Arion, you said we've still got a long way to go. I'm curious where we're going. What do you think is actually the optimum percentage representation of women? Because, you know, theoretically you'd say, well, 50% or whatever is reflected in the data of the population. But we know there are all sorts of reasons that women actually are disinclined perhaps to put themselves forward that aren't anything to do with ambition as well. For example, most famously having families. So what were you thinking is the number that we should be aiming at?
Well and truly over 50% to level out the fact that we've had it the other way for so long. Maybe I don't know. I don't think that there is necessarily an optimal number that you could pick out off the top of your head.
But political parties will,
50%.
won't they? Political parties will say, well, we want 50% female candidates at the next election. Is that the right thing to do?
No, it's
growing
not.
Anyway.
And I think it comes down to the glass ceiling again. It's, you know, we need to be careful as well when we look at the data. When we see positive trends about women being elected to office, a lot of that depends on the level of office as well. I mean, a lot of people noticed at the G20 summit in Buenos Aires that Theresa May was the only female leader there. There was Christine Lagarde, who's head of the IMF, but not head of any state. And Theresa May was just this one, you know, female face in a sea of male office holders. So it is important to make sure that not only are women being elected, but they are being elected to the top offices as well.
And interestingly, I read an article that talked not only about the glass ceiling, but the glass cliff edge, that apparently there's a high likelihood that women get appointed to boards when companies are struggling. Now we've got an entire nation that's struggling, and you've got Theresa May trying to steady that ship. Maybe it's a good idea to put women in charge at times of great crisis. But certainly 50% does seem a good starting point.
It doesn't seem to be the case either that women leaders promote peace. I mean, that's a bit of a cliche, isn't it, to say that?
Oh, I wouldn't. I mean, obviously, you're always going to have exceptions, Margaret Thatcher, etc. But
Aung San Suu Kyi.
And her. But research has found, and obviously, you know, you've got to take this all with a pinch of salt, but certainly a recent study found that when parliamentary representation of women increases by 5%, that country is 5 times less likely to respond to an international crisis with violence. Now, whether that's because women are at the helm or because women are at the helm because it's a more liberal society is a matter for debate. But I think certainly women can, you know, gender diversity in leadership has been linked with higher performance, improved policy outcomes, less corrupt societies. But yeah, it's the chicken and the egg, whether that's because the women are there or whether the women are there because it's that a conducive atmosphere.
And also whether some of the men that become leaders are men because they've been army generals or because they have an aggressive background or, you know, in the case of Trump, you know, very sort of dynamic, aggressive business person. I mean, that is the kind of men you get as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think a lot of the figures that people are thinking of when they say that, you know, female leaders don't necessarily promote peace. For example, Margaret Thatcher, you know, they came to prominence in a time when it was difficult as a woman to run for office. And so I think that would tend to self-select a certain type of person who is very, you know, whether or not you approve of her policy, she was certainly very determined, ruthless, some would say, you know, and quite aggressive, almost a kind of competing with the male politicians of the time in macho posturing, which I think when you see women as a group entering politics is when you do tend to see that more positive effect, you know, which is just sort of a natural outcome, really, of, you know, we were talking earlier about the challenges of women being caregivers in the majority of situations. And so when you see women en masse entering politics, then you do see those more, you know, family-friendly policies coming into play just as a natural consequence.
And I think you're right, Olly, that there's a tendency to assume some sort of pop psychological explanation that if you'd have more female leaders, then necessarily you're going to end up with a more compassionate, more collaborative type of government. And I'm not sure that that is necessarily the case, and we won't entirely know until we have more women leaders around the world.
And moving away from politics, this year has unquestionably, it seems to me, been a year where a big trend has been, I suppose, the gender debate, if you're going to call it something, which I'm using to catch all around gender pay gaps, the Me Too movement, debates around trans identity. I mean, for want of a better phrase, those gender discussions, they are one of the big things that have moved absolutely mainstream in the past 12 months, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the challenge is going to be to keep the momentum high. You know, we've already seen a kind of cultural backlash against some aspects of, for instance, the Me Too movement. And, you know, I think it is easy for these kinds of movements to lose their momentum. It's easy to think that when things have evolved in a positive direction, they're going to keep evolving that way. But that isn't necessarily always the case. It can stagnate or even roll back. You know, as we've seen kind of with the rise of nationalism and white supremacy, it's an ongoing struggle to keep those kind of retrograde forces tamped down.
But I'm retreating to the format, Rebecca. What I'm asking really is, do you think 2018 will be a significant year in raising the awareness of inequality for women, in fighting for women's rights? Will it be like 1918 when women first had the vote?
I think necessarily because of the Me Too movement, at least in terms of the decade, this year is going to be remembered as a significant year for the emergence of a movement that's promoting a sort of gender-based equality. Whether we'll still remember it in another 100 years as a turning point where things really did properly change, I think if you look at the statistical uptick of how many more women leaders there are in politics, it looks like we're on a good trajectory. But I mean, you have to see the same things replicated on boards. You have to see the same things replicated around the world. And I don't know that we're there yet. So it's a step in the right direction, but there's still, as we say, a long way to go.
Kari, you're next after this. Okay, Kari, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
I think this is the week we ask, why are we still on the slippery slope of oil dependence?
So we imposed the strongest sanctions in the history of our country, just about. Well, I guess North Korea's there too. But I gave some countries a break on the oil. I did it a little bit because they really asked for some help. But I really did it because I don't want to drive oil prices up to $100 a barrel or $150 a barrel, because I'm driving them down. If you look at oil prices, they've come down very substantially over the last couple of months. That's because of me.
That was John Coleshaw on Dead Ringers. Oh, no, it was actually the President of America, Donald Trump, telling us why oil prices have stayed low. So, Kari, why this particular Trump story? Of all the Trump stories that you could have picked, why oil?
There are so many. Well, obviously, as you say, this is Trump claiming credit after oil prices fell from a 4-year high, and recently they've really slumped. He's claiming credit, saying, you know, this is because the previous week he'd granted sanctions waivers to 8 countries to allow them to continue importing Iranian crude oil for a limited amount of time. In another way that he has actually helped push down oil prices, much as I hate to credit him for anything, is by increasing output of oil. And actually what caught my attention to this topic was a recent New York Times article talking about how Donald Trump is basically speedily clearing the way for oil exploration in Alaska. And he's been rolling back federal policies protecting the environment and really fast-tracking environmental evaluations to drill in a place called the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge.
Which sounds like a horrible thing, you know, and you think, well, why would it be a wildlife refuge and designated as such if they intended to drill for oil there? But I read that New York Times article as well. I'd recommend it actually over the holidays. It's a long read, isn't it?
It's a very long read.
Sit down for like half an hour and get into
this. It'll probably take the holidays, but yeah.
But it's not as simple as that. It's not just Trump who wants it. There are obviously Alaskan politicians and
sure.
Alaskan natives who want it as well.
Yeah, but so basically what they think is that there's the largest untapped onshore reserve of oil in North America. It's believed to lie beneath the refuge's coastal plain. The refuge itself covers 19 million acres, so you get a real sense of just how much could be down there. And there have been previous attempts to drill during the Obama presidency. There were attempts, but they got knocked back. Environmental campaigners are very worried about the threat to wildlife, polar bears and, other wildlife. But to me, what the key sort of headline here is that despite all the overwhelming evidence of carbon-fueled climate change and billions in subsidies for alternate technologies such as wind and solar power, it was reported in October, not very widely, that the world had actually just passed a record level of oil consumption of 100 million barrels per day, which was much sooner than expected and twice the amount that was being consumed 50 years ago. So despite all the sort of the advances that we've been making environmentally, and despite, all these meetings of various world leaders trying to combat climate change, in the background, global oil consumption is skyrocketing, and it's expected to continue to do so.
Okay, but that's looking at the fate of the world. Looking at the opinion of Americans, politically, this isn't a stupid thing to do, is it? This is a savvy thing to do for Trump. He promised it during the election campaign. He has delivered it. There is cheaper oil in America now. America does run on oil. Look at what happened in France this year when Macron did the opposite. Actually, you can't really blame Trump for doing this, can you?
No, and I suppose any country that's sitting on oil reserves is going to be tempted to extract that oil and make money off it. That doesn't mean that it's what should be done. And I think as Kari's saying, the point is we're very aware now of the effect of oil extraction and carbon and the use of carbon generally on the environment. And it really needs to be stopped. So, yes.
Okay, so I'll rephrase my question. You can blame Trump for it, clearly. You can blame Trump for it. But what my question was, you can understand why Republican voters would applaud Trump for it.
I can, but it doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do.
Of course, but that's politics, isn't it?
The US public isn't behind drilling in this refuge. The US public likes to get oil from abroad. They don't want to drill at home. A poll last year found that 70% of US voters are against drilling in this refuge. So in fact, he doesn't have that political support. What he's got is the support of the big money companies. That's where it's coming from.
It depends how you ask the question, though, doesn't it? Surely, Rebecca, you ask an American, do you want cheaper oil? Answer, yes.
Well, yeah, absolutely. It's definitely, in America, they're very used to having incredibly cheap petrol prices anyway. And in fact, the majority of oil, I think it's something about 60%, the majority of oil that's used in the world is used for transport around the world. And obviously, that's one of the things that makes it difficult to fully embrace green technologies is that, some sectors are far easier to convert to green power than others. And transport is a difficult one, especially as oil demand in the developed world has started to stagnate, and we're even hearing about oversupply now, which is crazy because it's amazing how much the conversations change. I remember when I was a kid, it was all about when the oil runs out, imminently. It was kind of sort of lingering anxiety I had, and now, we're hearing about oversupply. But demand now is being driven by developing countries. It's a bit difficult to ask countries like China, India, countries in Africa. You can't pursue the rapid improvement in your living standards that we enjoyed, 50 or 100 years ago. You have to either embrace these incredibly expensive green technologies. They're expensive and difficult to implement in countries that don't have a developed infrastructure in place already, or contribute to your own decline in a lot of cases by fueling climate change.
The problem is, have we not sort of fudged the question here? There was a recent, the 24th Conference of Parties where world leaders, scientists and campaigners all went to Poland and tried to hammer out the rules governing how the commitments in the 2015 Paris Agreement are going to be met. And that comes into force in 2020. But they postponed all the big decisions on things like pledging more ambitious action to fight global warming. And particularly, they didn't talk about how the controversial market for carbon emissions trading that lets rich nations pay for carbon cutting projects in other countries instead of reducing their own emissions. So we're just shifting the buck. And you can understand, you try and go before shareholders in some major oil company and go, well, okay, we're going to lose millions, but, 20 years down the line, our air's going to be a lot cleaner. So you can understand why this is happening, but no one is willing to make that initial sacrifice. And in the meantime, although, yes, as Rebecca says, oil use is stagnating in the West, it's soaring in developing countries, and that's expected to make overall global consumption climb for at least the next 2 decades.
Arion.
And I think there's only so far we want to extend our willingness to understand any country, be it in the developing world or in the developed world, that wants to continue to exploit oil, because we know that this is a global problem and we need to tackle it together. And so, yes, of course, it's going to be cheaper and more efficient to use existing technologies right now. But continuing to do so is the thing that prevents progress towards the development of proper green technologies. So it's not an area we want to be sympathetic to countries that want to just continue to burn oil, because that way lies absolute global disaster.
Okay, so is there any good news to say about this?
I've
Could
got
we
some.
go on?
Yeah, I've got one. You know who's really quite proactive on this is China. We're always, I find we're always bringing up China and slagging it off. And China is the biggest consumer of oil in the world and the biggest producer of carbon. But bear with me, they've spent more money on investing in green technologies this year than the EU and the US combined, $132 billion. And if you look up some of the projects that they're working on, and I just want to say at this point that you're probably thinking, like, can we trust the Chinese government? Are there, what's
You're supposing a lot of things about the psychology of our listeners, Rebecca.
But they've
You're just revealing your own internal monologue.
Well, I feel like we're negative about China quite a lot, so
Sure.
we've probably built up this inherent
Okay,
Chinese.
and B?
Well, so my point is this, that China has actually had amazing success on a lot of homegrown environmental projects, like conservation has actually had really significant impact. And so that now that they're turning to green energy, I think there is reason for cautious optimism. If you look at some of the projects they've got, like enormous hydropower dams, enormous wind farms, solar roads, projects on a scale that we can barely even imagine.
But isn't it about being carbon neutral in the future? So it's all very well saying China's spending a lot on environmental alternatives, and that's good. But as you say, it doesn't even match what they're spending on the things that are bad for the environment. I mean, actually, do you think we'll see a country in the next couple of years come out and say, right, in 12 months' time, we're going to be carbon neutral?
It will be a much smaller country than China. I mean,
right. So that's the problem, isn't it?
The thing is that the Chinese industrial sector is so incredibly massive that obviously what they are investing in green technology is kind of a drop in the ocean. But I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. They're not going to be leading the transfer to a carbon neutral society by any means, though.
I mean, it is a step in the right direction, but is it not just a sticking plaster on a gaping great wound? These are very, in terms of the amount of just the sheer huge amounts of oil that they're consuming, for example. It's not going to go close to actually offsetting the effects of that.
What are you going to do?
Yeah.
Give us a prediction for 2019 about this Alaskan situation then, Kari. Do you think that actually over the next year this will go away?
No. I think, at the moment they're on...
You said the public don't want it.
No, they don't, but... Trump does a lot of things the public doesn't want. They're set to finish the environmental impact assessment in half the usual time. On the current sort of track they're on, they could be testing across the tundra within months, which in itself is going to have a potentially disastrous effect on wildlife. The Interior Department is expected to start selling the first drilling leases by next year. So no, I think this is happening.
Okay, Rebecca, time for your story after this. Okay, finally this week it's Rebecca. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Was this the last ride of the Internet Wild West?
As currently written by the European Parliament, Article 13 could mean that YouTube is forced to block millions of existing and new videos in the EU. It could drastically limit the content that you can upload to YouTube in Europe. This would be especially hard for creators and artists since many types of videos could be blocked. Those include educational videos, lots of official music videos, fan music covers, and mashups, parodies, and more.
That was Matt, a man with no last name apparently, on YouTube's Creator Academy channel. You can find the whole riveting video there. Rebecca, copyright law, ending 2018 on a high.
Stick with me.
Please.
This is just one aspect of a broader topic that I will get into. But so just briefly, Article 13 is a European copyright directive.
No, you're going to have to be more
I know,
enthusiastic.
I'm so sorry.
No, come on,
well,
why?
Pick it up.
Article 13.
Yes, Article 13. Woo! Article 13.
What does it do?
So it's already been passed by the European Parliament. It's now gone back to EU member states to be approved, and it's going to go back to European Parliament in January, where it will probably
What does
pass.
it do?
I'll tell you what it does.
Yes.
It puts the legal onus of stopping copyrighted material from getting on the internet onto platforms such as YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, etc.
And this is the underlying trend of the year.
Yes. Now,
Why?
what this means for you as the user of the internet is that basically...
I am the sole user.
Yes, Olly Mann, internet user.
Welcome to my mind.
What this means is that the only way that social media platforms and things like YouTube will be able to meet the standards that are going to be required of them is to implement scanning that will stop you from uploading copyright content before you do it. At the moment, technically we are probably often, all of us, breaking copyright law, by uploading screenshots from movies, GIFs, stuff like that that's actually copyrighted. The problem with this is that at the moment, stuff like that would be considered fair use. If you're using it for parody, satire, memes, that would be considered fair use. But this kind of pre-scanning technology, which a lot of people are saying would be the only way to implement this, would mean that you couldn't upload anything like that because the scanner would never be sophisticated enough to tell if you're using it as a parody or whether you're using it to actually infringe
But if you're
copyright.
using 3 seconds of a movie in which someone gives a standing ovation or something, and you're using that as a GIF to put on a tweet.
That's what those who are worried about this, which include Sir Tim Berners-Lee and Wikipedia founder Jimmy Wales, they're kind of leading this charge, saying that basically it's going to make it impossible for you to do. Well,
It won't. If you're doing that, the computer doesn't need to understand the context. It knows A, it's 3 seconds, and B, anyway, surely the obvious resolution of this will just be it'll get tagged with the copyright symbol. It'll just say copyright 20th Century Fox.
No, because you have to pay for licenses. You can't just stick a C
But what if you
symbol
actually
on
click
something.
through from the meme and that gave you the chance to buy the film? That would be quite good, wouldn't it?
They may have to come to some kind of arrangement like that.
So it'll be fine, won't it?
Is that the scanning technology that they would need is not really even there yet, and so then expecting it to be like, well, can you also make sure you filter out this kind of content or this kind of content is kind of impossible.
I'm giving her a hard time, Arion. Do you agree with Rebecca that this is the end of internet creativity, potentially?
I think that she is absolutely right to bring the story to the table. It is a big deal, and I think that's why so many people are concerned about it. I think that the underlying desire of the European Parliament is actually a just one. That what they're trying to do is to make sure that creators are being properly recompensed for their creativity. And I think that, since the internet was born, this has been a problem for pretty much everyone. That if you're a journalist or if you're an artist or if you're a filmmaker, there's every chance that your intellectual property is ending up on the internet in ways that are not being policed. So you can sort of see why it's not just the sort of Europe that's trying to deal with this problem, but various other countries as well. But I think the way that they're coming at it is muddle-headed, and it could end up sweeping up a whole lot of fair use types of behaviours online that we wouldn't want to see shut down.
But they've already said they won't punish individual users, haven't they? So that actually this is aimed at the Googles, the Facebooks, the YouTubes, to make sure that when you, for example, right-click an image and save it to your computer and you're about to distribute it in some other way for your own commercial gain, that's not so easy.
That affects you, and you want to upload, when you want to post on Twitter a GIF of Orson Welles clapping. Well, good luck. Who are you going to get by the license fee off of that?
But they said it won't affect individual users.
Affect you, but it will
when
stop
I said I'm talking about you, for example, as an organisation putting it on the week.
That's an absolute, that's an absolute red herring, because how are you going to get it online without going through one of these platforms? And the platforms are the ones that are obligated to stop you from posting it. So really, it makes no difference. If you've got an ISP or if you've got a Twitter account or a YouTube account, they're the ones that are going to be stopping you from uploading it. So it's like when, and this is actually kind of what I wanted to broaden it out into, is the way that the internet is being increasingly regulated and policed in a way that is completely alien to the early days of the internet, when it really was a free-for-all. And in some ways that's good, and in some ways I think it's quite harmful, and I think this is one of them.
Well, the early days of the internet, Kari, were about people doing it for fun or because they believed in it and sharing for free. The reason it's changing now, surely, is because actually the internet now is a big marketplace where a few big corporations are making a lot of money, and it's right to say some of that money should trickle down to the creators.
I agree with that. I think in the early days we all had quite a naive view of the internet, and that it was going to be this big worldwide web that was going to let everyone speak and be open to all. And it's not. It's basically splintered. There's this expression that's now going around, the splinternet, because the regulatory landscapes of different geographical regions are drifting apart. You've got firewalls going up in China for political reasons. You've got the more laudable aims of things like, the new Tumblr ban on porn, which is intended,
as discussed in last week's Week Unwrapped,
which is intended to sort of prevent porn. There've been discussions about introducing similar firewalls in the US and Australia. So I think these are all very laudable aims. But there has been a massive power grab by the likes of Google, Facebook, And it's basically the power has been centralized. It's much harder for startup platforms to try and get out there because they just get slapped down. And it's just created a string of closed networks, whether it's app stores, social networks, algorithm feeds, that's much more powerful than the web now.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Tumblr porn ban is another good example of the fact that individuals don't really have direct access to the internet except through other providers and other platforms. The whole reason that Tumblr did crack down was because most people are accessing it through an app that they get on the iPhone App Store. And so our routes to the internet are increasingly being curated by private companies who don't want to be, if they don't want to be associated with certain things, then they'll just stop those things from being on there.
Is some of this kind of intellectualizing, though, Arion, in terms of how most people, ordinary people, engage with the internet? Maybe if they had Rebecca's deep understanding and passion for European Parliament directives, they'd begin to understand the implications on their lives. But generally speaking, as we saw with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, for example, journalists get very upset about it. Lots of column inches in the Observer. Most people carry on using Facebook and basically either don't understand or don't care.
No, I don't think this is one of those. I think that if you've ever used the internet in China, you see what a massive difference it makes to the user end experience once you start limiting the openness that we have up until now enjoyed. And honestly, in a world where you can't use Google and you can't use Facebook and things are being shut off from you as a user, there are real problems with what you're able to get out of the experience. And I think this one actually does matter enormously.
Now, we're different to the other news and current affairs podcasts in that we have made it through the whole year, almost, without mentioning the B word. But I am going to in this instance, because after Brexit, surely what the European Parliament does is actually relevant to us in particular. This could be a boon, couldn't it, if you actually don't want to be part of this?
No, and I think if you've been monitoring the way that GDPR has been implemented, you've seen that what's happened is that rather than try and separate out EU users from regular US users, etc., a lot of US news sites for instance, have started using geo-blocking. So if you're accessing from the EU, they'll just cut you off from the content. LA Times is a prominent example, and I think that could have serious implications for EU internet users as well if Article 13 does come into place.
But that wasn't what I asked. We won't be in the EU, so are we going to be affected by this?
But if you are Facebook and if the onus is on you to police what every single user who uses Facebook is able to download or upload according to EU regulations, and there is every conceivable chance that they will try to block off whole areas of the world that they haven't yet got the technology to enforce those new regulations on. So we could see it affecting us. It's not clear, but it could definitely sweep up whole swathes of the world.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for all your suggestions of the stories of the year. I'm glad I don't have to choose a victor. As ever, here on The Week Unwrapped, there are no winners. That is it from this edition. My thanks to Arion McNicoll, Rebecca Gillie and Kari Wilkin, and our sponsor, Barclays Corporate Banking. Their industry experts can help your business, even in 2019. To find out more, visit barclayscorporate.com/theweek. And throughout the year ahead, make sure you never miss an episode of this show by subscribing to the podcast. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your app of choice and hit subscribe. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producers, Chica Ayres and Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again in 2019 to unwrap the first week of the year. Bye-bye.